The day before the wedding I paid for, my fiancé smiled. You know what would be the perfect gift? You and your kids disappearing from our lives forever. So I did exactly that. Sold the house they thought was their wedding gift and left an envelope at every guest's table. What was inside, she'll never forget. Ernest had delivered babies at 3 in the morning, stitched tears, with hands steadier than his heartbeat, and spoken gently to terrified fathers who looked as if the world had cracked open under their feet. He knew what panic looked like. He knew what joy looked like. He knew exactly how fast a life could change. But nothing in 12 years as an obstetrician prepared him for the moment his fiancée smiled across a linen-covered rehearsal dinner table and said in the same cheerful tone she used to ask for more champagne, "You know what would be the perfect wedding gift? You and your kids disappearing from our lives forever." For a second, the room kept moving like normal. Crystal glasses glinted under the chandeliers. Her bridesmaids laughed at something at the far end of the room. A waiter poured wine into a glass Ernest no longer remembered ordering. The string quartet in the corner kept sawing through some delicate arrangement that suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. Ernest stared at her. "Excuse me?" he asked quietly. Vanessa tilted her head, still smiling. Beautiful, polished, immaculate Vanessa, with the sleek dark hair, the fitted ivory rehearsal dress, and the kind of face people trusted too quickly. "Oh, don't give me that look," she said, waving one manicured hand. "I'm joking. Mostly. Mostly." That single word landed harder than a slap. At Ernest's side, his 12-year-old daughter Lily had gone very still. His 8-year-old son Noah, who had been poking at the icing flower on a dessert plate, looked up with the alert confusion of a child who knows something bad just happened but doesn't yet understand how bad. "Vanessa," Ernest said, his voice lower now, "what exactly do you mean?" She sighed, as if he were being difficult on purpose. "I mean," she said, leaning closer, "we're getting married tomorrow. It's supposed to be a fresh start, a real life, our life. And honestly, your kids make everything complicated. They're always there, they're always watching, your ex is always in the background. It's messy." Lily's eyes dropped to her lap. Ernest felt his pulse begin to hammer behind his eyes. "They are my children." "Yes, and I have been very patient about that," Vanessa replied. "But let's be honest. You've spent this whole engagement acting like I'm joining some pre-built family where I just have to fit myself into the corners. I'm not interested in living in a museum to your first marriage." Noah blinked. "Dad?" Ernest put a hand on his son's shoulder without taking his eyes off Vanessa. "It's okay, buddy." Vanessa laughed softly. "See? That. Every conversation becomes about them." One of her bridesmaids at the next table glanced over, sensing tension, then quickly looked away. Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. "You bought that ridiculous huge house because you said the kids needed space. You put their names into every decision, where we vacation, what neighborhood we chose, whether we could go out late, whether we could move, whether we could even redecorate the upstairs because Lily was still adjusting." Lily's cheeks flamed red. Ernest felt something inside him turn cold. Not hot, not explosive. Cold. "You asked me to move into that house," he said. "Yes, because I thought eventually you'd understand priorities." She sipped her wine. "Tomorrow was supposed to be the beginning of that. I thought maybe after the wedding, you'd finally stop treating me like second place in my own marriage." "You are not in second place," he said. Vanessa smiled again, but now it was sharp. "Then, prove it." Silence. She leaned in and whispered, "Send them to their mother full time. Sell the house. We start over somewhere smaller, somewhere ours. No extra bedrooms, no reminders. No custody chaos. No baggage." Lily made a tiny choking sound. Ernest turned to his daughter. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her whole body locked in the kind of rigid dignity children wear when they're trying not to cry in public. Noah had pressed himself against Ernest's side, sensing the danger now. And in that instant, more than anything Vanessa had said, Ernest understood the truth. This was not a cruel joke. This was the mask slipping. He looked back at her. "You said you loved them." "I said I tried," Vanessa corrected. "There's a difference." Then, smiling as a waiter set down the next course, she added in a bright conversational voice, "Honestly, If you and your kids disappeared from our lives forever, that would be the best gift I could get. Ernest looked at her for another long second. Then he stood. He took Noah's hand. Lily rose without a word. Ernest, Vanessa said, annoyed now. Don't be dramatic. He looked down at her, calm enough to frighten himself. No, he said. I'm finally done being blind. He walked his children out of the rehearsal dinner without another word. Behind him, he heard Vanessa call his name once, then again, sharper the second time. He did not turn around. By the time the restaurant doors closed behind them and the cool evening air hit his face, Lily was crying silently. Noah asks the question Ernest had been dreading. Dad, he whispered, does she hate us? Ernest knelt on the pavement in his suit and pulled both of them into his arms. No, he said, though he already knew the more honest answer was worse. She doesn't get to define who you are. And nobody gets to make you feel unwanted in your own family. Do you hear me? Lily clung to him harder. I heard her, Dad. I know. You were still going to marry her tomorrow? That one cut deep, because for a few terrible seconds, he could not answer. He had spent 14 months planning a future with Vanessa. He had ignored the little moments. The way she called the kids a lot after weekends with them. The way she referred to his late wife, Margaret, as the ghost in the room, even though Margaret had died 6 years earlier from an aggressive cancer that left Ernest raising 2 children alone while finishing fellowship. The way Vanessa pushed every discussion toward what she wanted, then called compromise emotional maturity. He had mistaken tolerance for kindness. He had mistaken charm for character. And his children had paid for his mistake. No, he said finally. I'm not marrying her. Noah looked up. Really? Really? Lily wiped her face with the heel of her hand. What now? Ernest stood slowly, still holding both of them. Now, he said, I make sure she never forgets what she said tonight. The next morning, Vanessa woke up expecting a wedding day. Instead, she woke up to absence. No good morning text. No flowers sent to her suite. No last-minute check-in from Ernest. No affectionate message saying he was on the way to the venue. By 8:30, her first call went unanswered. By 9, she had left 5 voicemails. By 9:15, her maid of honor was pounding on Ernest's hotel room door, only to discover he had checked out before dawn. By 10, the venue coordinator called Vanessa in a panic because the final payment had been reversed. The florist had not been admitted, and the catering manager had received instructions from the account holder to hold all service pending distribution of correspondence. Distribution of what? Vanessa snapped into the phone. The coordinator hesitated. Envelopes, apparently. Vanessa's face drained of color, because while she had spent the early hours spiraling between outrage and disbelief, Ernest had already been moving. Not frantically, methodically. He had spent half the night at his kitchen table with his laptop open, the children asleep upstairs at his sister's house after too many tears and too much ice cream they hadn't really tasted. He had called an attorney friend at 11:40 p.m. He had called the venue at midnight. He had reviewed every contract tied to the wedding, every transfer, every account, every asset Vanessa believed was already hers in spirit, if not in law, especially the house. The house had become a symbol during the engagement. A sprawling 5-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street purchased solely in Ernest's name 18 months earlier. Vanessa had referred to it constantly as our forever house, though she had contributed nothing to the down payment, mortgage, or renovations. Her family had toured it like a trophy. Her mother had told people, not quietly, that Ernest was finally proving he understood Vanessa's worth. Vanessa had assumed that after the wedding, the house would simply become hers by narrative gravity. She was wrong. At 6:15 that morning, Ernest met with a broker who had already shown interest from a private buyer weeks ago, when Ernest had casually inquired about market timing. By 7:40, after a brutally simple conversation, he signed the preliminary agreement to sell. Not because he needed the money, because he no longer wanted a single memory of Vanessa touching that place. By 9 o'clock, movers were at the property removing the pieces that belonged to Ernest, Lily, and Noah. The things Vanessa had chosen for herself remained exactly where they were, tagged for return or disposal. At 10:30, Every reception table at the venue had an ivory envelope placed neatly beside the charger plate, one for every guest. At 11:05, the first guests began to arrive. At 11:17, Vanessa stormed into the bridal suite, white with fury, clutching one of the envelopes in trembling fingers. "What is this?" she shouted. Her mother stood behind her, scandalized. Two bridesmaids hovered by the mirror, frozen. Vanessa ripped the envelope open. Inside was a single folded letter and 3 printed pages. The letter was addressed to our family and friends. Since many of you gathered here today believing you were attending a celebration of love, honesty requires that you know why there will be no wedding. Below that, Ernest's handwriting disappeared into typed text. He explained, clearly and without melodrama, that the previous evening, in front of witnesses and his children, Vanessa had told him that the perfect gift would be for him and his children to disappear from our lives forever. He wrote that he could forgive many things directed at himself, but he would never marry anyone who asked him to erase his children to make herself comfortable. Then came the printed pages. The first was a copy of the property deed showing the house belonged solely to Ernest and had never been promised, transferred, or gifted. The second was a transcript from a voice memo Ernest had started on his phone midway through the rehearsal dinner. After the first chilling lines made him realize what he was hearing. Vanessa's words were there in black and white. Send them to their mother full-time. Sell the house. We start over somewhere smaller, somewhere ours. No extra bedrooms, no reminders, no custody chaos, no baggage. If you and your kids disappeared from our lives forever, that would be the best gift I could get. The third page was the shortest. It read, for those who accepted gifts, accommodations, flights, or expenses paid by me for this event, consider your lunch covered. Enjoy it. Then please remember that when someone tells you who they are, especially around children, believe them the first time. At the bottom, in handwriting again, Vanessa, you wanted a fresh start. Here it is. Ernest. When the first guests finished reading, the atmosphere in the reception hall changed from festive to electric. Aunties whispered. Groomsmen stared. Friends passed pages back and forth with widening eyes. Someone murmured, "My God." Someone else said, in front of his kids, one of Vanessa's college friends quietly put down her mimosa and left. By the time Vanessa reached the ballroom, at least half the room already knew. Her mother hissed, "This is slander." One of the guests, a lawyer, lifted the transcript page. Not if it's accurate. Vanessa's maid of honor, pale and shaken, asked the question nobody else had dared. Did you say this? Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, and then did what people do when the truth corners them. She attacked the reaction. He recorded me, she burst out. That psychopath recorded a private conversation. Private. One of Ernest's colleagues said incredulously, "Your stepchildren were right there. They are not my stepchildren." That did it. A hush dropped over the room so fast it felt physical. Vanessa looked around and realized, too late, that she had just confirmed everything. Her father muttered, "Vanessa?" She spun toward him. "What? So now everyone's going to pretend he's some saint? He never put me first. Never. It was always those kids. That dead wife, that stupid house, his hospital schedule." A chair scraped violently as one of Ernest's older relatives stood up. "Those children lost their mother," the woman said, voice shaking with rage. "And you wanted them gone because they inconvenienced your wedding aesthetic?" Vanessa flushed scarlet. "You don't know anything about what it's like being with a man who's emotionally unavailable because he's obsessed with his past." At that, one of Ernest's colleagues, Dr. Priya Raman, who had worked beside him for years through impossible deliveries and worse losses, stepped forward. "I know exactly what kind of man Ernest is," she said. "He works 30-hour shifts and still makes every school performance. He sits with grieving parents long after his shift ends. He built his life back from the ground up after burying his wife. If he left, you earned it." No one clapped. It was too ugly for that. But heads nodded. Vanessa looked from face to face and saw no sympathy, only judgment, only disbelief. Only the slow, devastating understanding that the audience she had curated for her perfect day had become witnesses for her humiliation instead. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Messages flooded in, guests canceling, friends asking if it was true. One bridesmaid texting that she was taking a cab home, another saying she felt sick and needed space, a cousin forwarding screenshots, because somehow, of course, the letter had already been photographed and sent beyond the room. Vanessa's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "Where is he?" she demanded. But Ernest was already gone. He was at a diner 40 minutes away, sitting across from Lily and Noah in a booth that smelled like coffee and syrup and safety. The children were still dressed too nicely for pancakes. Lily had taken off the cardigan she'd worn to the rehearsal dinner and tied it around her waist like armor. Noah was building a wall out of creamer cups. Ernest had not hidden the truth from them that morning. He told them the wedding was canceled. He told them the house was being sold because they were starting fresh somewhere else, somewhere better. He told them none of this was their fault. Lily stirred her hot chocolate. "Did you really leave letters for everyone?" "Yes." Her mouth twitched for the first time in 12 hours. Savage. He let out a small laugh, surprised by it. "That is not a word I expected from my daughter before noon." Noah leaned forward. "Did she cry?" Ernest paused. "Probably." "Good," Noah said with fierce little boy certainty, and went back to his creamer fort. Lily looked at her father over the rim of her cup. "You heard her before, didn't you? Not just last night. That, more than anything, made him ache." "Yes," he admitted. "I think I heard pieces of it. I just kept telling myself I was misunderstanding. Why? Because he was lonely. Because after Margaret died, half the world treated him like a tragedy in a pressed shirt. Because single fatherhood and medicine and grief had hollowed him out in places he never talked about. Because Vanessa had been bright and attentive and flattering in the beginning, and he had wanted so badly to believe that wanting a future again made him brave instead of foolish. But he would not put that burden on his daughter. Because adults can be stupid too, he said. Lily gave a solemn nod, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "You fixed it," she said. He looked at his daughter, his serious, observant, too old for 12 daughter, and nearly broke apart right there in the booth. "I'm trying," he said. "You did," she answered. The fallout was fast, public, and brutal. By evening, Vanessa's social circle had split into factions: the silent deserters, the defensive opportunists, and the handful of people who tried to claim the whole thing was more nuanced, until the audio clip started circulating in tighter circles among invited guests. That ended the nuance. Her employer, where image was currency and cruelty toward children, was terrible branding, asked her not to come in for a few days, while an internal review addressed conduct concerns raised publicly in association with the company. Her mother spent 2 days calling people to insist Vanessa had been under wedding stress. That explanation might have worked if Vanessa had screamed, thrown a drink, or had a breakdown. It worked less well for calmly suggesting that children should vanish. Meanwhile, Ernest said almost nothing. He returned calls from family. He ignored calls from Vanessa. He answered exactly one message from her 3 days later. It read, "You humiliated me in front of everyone over one comment. I hope it was worth it." He replied, "You humiliated yourself in front of 2 children. That was worth stopping." Then he blocked her. As for the house, the sale moved quickly. Faster than anyone expected, the buyer was cash-rich, decisive, and delighted to close early. Vanessa only learned the transaction had finalized when she drove past the property a week later and saw a sold sign staked into the front lawn like a verdict. She sat in her car and stared. According to a mutual acquaintance, who later repeated the scene with unkind accuracy, Vanessa had once described that house as the reward for finally dating a man with standards. Now, it belonged to strangers. Ernest used part of the proceeds to put a down payment on a smaller home near the children's school and near the hospital, a place with a wide backyard, a sunlit kitchen, and none of Vanessa's fingerprints anywhere. Lily chose paint for her room herself, Noah got the treehouse Ernest had been promising for 2 years. On the first night there, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor among boxes and pizza slices, Noah announced, "This house feels nicer. It has fewer ghosts," Lily said. Ernest looked at her. She shrugged. "Not Mom. Vanessa." And there it was, the difference children understand before adults do. Margaret had never been a ghost in that family. She had been memory, love, grief, foundation. Vanessa had been the haunting. In the weeks that followed, Ernest kept working. Babies still arrived screaming into fluorescent light. Mothers still labored, fathers still fainted. Charts still piled high. Life, indifferent and relentless, continued exactly as it always did. But something in him had shifted. He stopped apologizing for having children in professional spaces, stopped downplaying fatherhood as if it were an inconvenience to romance, stopped translating his life into smaller pieces to make other people comfortable. One evening, after a 14-hour shift, he came home to find Lily at the kitchen island doing homework and Noah asleep with crayons in his hand. The windows were open. The house smelled faintly of garlic bread and detergent and clean beginnings. Lily glanced up. "You look tired." "I am tired. Happy tired or bad tired?" He set down his bag and thought about it. "Happy tired," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her math. That was the thing no one tells you about reclaiming your life. The victory doesn't always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks like grocery lists, carpools, mortgage paperwork, a child asking whether your exhaustion is the good kind. Sometimes peace arrives quietly. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to give cruel people access to the life they thought they could rearrange. A month after the canceled wedding, Ernest received one final surprise. A cream envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. He recognized the name at the bottom only after a second. "Ernest, you don't know me well, but I was seated at table 9 at what was supposed to be your reception. I'm Vanessa's cousin, Claire. I brought my 2 daughters that day because they were meant to be flower girls. I want you to know I took them home early after reading your letter. And that night, I had a long conversation with them about self-respect, boundaries, and what love should never demand. For whatever it's worth, I'm glad your children saw you choose them. A lot of adults never do. They will remember that for the rest of their lives. Claire." Ernest read the note twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the kitchen drawer where he kept school certificates, Noah's weird little rock collection, and one crayon drawing Lily had made after Margaret died. 3 stick figures holding hands under a giant blue sky. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then he closed the drawer and went outside, where Noah was yelling from the half-built treehouse that he needed an actual surgeon level of help, confusing obstetrics with carpentry in a way only an 8-year-old could. Ernest laughed and headed into the yard. A year later, on the exact date that should have been his wedding anniversary, Ernest did not mark the loss. He marked the choice. He took Lily and Noah to the coast for the weekend. They ate greasy fries on a windy pier. Noah nearly lost a sneaker to the tide. Lily took photos of gulls and storm clouds, and her father looking embarrassed while holding 3 ice creams at once. That night, in adjoining hotel beds, the children fell asleep to the sound of waves against the shore. Ernest stood on the balcony alone. The air was cold. Salt clung to his skin. In the dark glass of the sliding door, he could see his own reflection. Older than he once imagined, a little wearier, but no longer divided. He thought about the man he had been the night before that wedding. Tired, hopeful, compromising in all the wrong places. Trying to convince himself that love required swallowing certain wounds. He thought about the words that had saved him by finally destroying the illusion. "You and your kids disappearing from our lives forever." She had meant it as a wish. He had turned it into an exit, not by vanishing from life, by vanishing from hers. And that, Ernest realized, had been the difference between abandonment and freedom. Behind him, Lily's sleepy voice drifted from the room. "Dad?" He stepped inside. "Yeah?" She was half awake, curls messy, eyes barely open. "Are we okay?" Ernest looked at his daughter. At his son, sprawled sideways across the mattress, with one arm flung over a pillow, at the ordinary, miraculous mess of the life that remained. Yes, he said. Then, with all the certainty of a man who had finally learned the cost of hesitation, we're more than okay. Lily smiled and drifted back to sleep. Ernest stood there a moment longer, listening to the ocean. He understood now that love is not proved by what you are willing to sacrifice blindly. It is proved by what you refuse to sacrifice at all. His children were never baggage. They were the whole map. And from the moment Vanessa asked him to erase them, the wedding was already over. The rest had simply been paperwork, envelopes, and consequences. He turned off the light and lay down in the dark, the sound of the sea filling the room like a promise. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt clean.